Hi and welcome to another edition of the Incidentally Reliable podcast, where we chat mostly with veterans in site reliability, talk about battle tested engineering innovations, mostly their war room stories and their opinions on the current state of reliability engineering. Today, we have with us someone who, in my opinion, has been one of the flag bearers of the site reliability engineering movement. We have Niall Murphy. He's an award-winning speaker, technologist. Now he's a full-fledged executive. He's leading Stanza Systems, his current startup. He's one of the authors of, I would say, the most defining, best-selling, industry-defining book on site reliability engineering. And before that, he led site reliability at Microsoft Azure and Google. Thank you for joining us today, Niall. Really
No
happy
worries
that you're here.
whatsoever. I just want to say I did lead some of Azure site reliability engineering, arguably the formal bit of the organization, but I didn't lead all of SRE at Google. That was a chap called Ben Trainer and Ben Lutch as well. So I only led small bits of it.
I'll No worries. Okay. I mean, it's still. I mean, you led reliability at mostly at Google Ads, right? That was the one product
That's
where you spend
correct.
most of your
About
time.
5 years or thereabouts. Yeah.
Awesome. So, Niall, I mean, there are like a lot of things that we had planned for today. A lot of questions that we wanted to ask. I think the first, before we sort of dig into the past, would love to learn a little bit about Stanza. What are the problems that you're currently working on at Stanza Systems? What's the idea behind Stanza? What's the sort of like long term mission?
Yep. So we are in the reliability space generally. I think that won't be a surprise to any of your watchers or listeners. The first thing we are doing is in the traffic management space, which is to say we deal with rate limiting and we deal with touch on observability. We try and make traffic flow well inside your application, and we try and prevent certain kinds of DDoS or overwhelm from destroying backend services. It turns out that actually a lot of very successful companies have architectures that are strangely amenable to kind of blowing up when traffic tends to go the wrong way, which it does every so often. So uh, at a technical conference, I would introduce ourselves by saying we do rate limiting as a service, and I think again, the technical audience listening to this will probably know what that means.
I mean, I was wondering what are the couple of sort of problems that you saw in the past that led you to start a company specifically solving this problem? I mean, maybe if there are experiences in the past where you thought, hey, this is one problem that really needs to be solved, and I'm going to be the one doing it, right? What motivated you to actually
Yeah,
solve
really
this
good
specific problem?
question. So a bunch of us have a background in traffic management. So when we were all sitting around thinking about what we would start a company around, this kind of stuff kind of naturally suggested itself. I spent a short while on what was called traffic team at Google, which is essentially, for various historical reasons, it considered itself one of the primary kind of SRE teams in Google looking after production services. But in particular, it was responsible for any time that anyone made a HTTP connection to www.google.com or like any of the Google properties, it would go through systems managed by this team. So as you can imagine, when you have the world uh, essentially opening connections to you all the time and messing with stuff, you come across a very interesting array of problems. So that was both a demanding and a kind of intellectually interesting position to be in. But it turns out that actually a lot of the problems that folks encounter when running their websites or running their back end and front end as well, this actually applies kind of equally to both, which is one of the interesting things about this particular situation because, and I'm going to open a huge kind of open bracket here, but it turns out that one of the features of the SRE movement, if we call it that, is that reliability is often perceived to be a matter that back-end teams kind of exclusively own. And so they talk about it in the language of back-end, and they bring back-end style concepts to examine this, where actually it turns out that when you take a kind of a wider view, front-end concepts and analysis and language are also relevant for thinking about what the user experience is and the perceived reliability. So I think this is a huge kind of gap in what we're doing with reliability in the industry. Close long bracket. But the set of problems that flow from kind of poor traffic management are, if you have tried to buy a concert ticket in the past couple of years, you will probably have encountered, for example, the Taylor Swift effect. And
Yep.
if you have encountered a spinny logo on some website when it's trying to show you something, that is often a request that's gone astray, a request that's taking a very long time, which often, not always, indicates some kind of back-end capacity problem. Auto scaling also interacts quite poorly with reliability, and reliability generally, because what happens is people say, I have some problem with the amount of work that my users are commanding me to do by issuing requests to my website. I know I'll enable auto scaling, and then, as the famous phrase goes, then you have two problems.
Yep.
All of these problems, which seem to occur on a relatively abstract level with respect to capacity of systems and how they talk to each other and latencies and all of that kind of stuff, actually end up making a very concrete kind of difference to how people experience the reliability on websites. I think this is probably something that larger sites face more often, like the e-commerce giants and so on, would definitely experience this kind of thing. But it more or less happens to everyone once you get to a sufficient size.
Got it. I was actually reading your piece on graceful degradation, right? I think is that something that people should design for from day one, right? And is what you're building basically allowing them to degrade a little
Yes,
more
so
gracefully?
we have a back end and a front end component to what we do. The front end component is a way to be aware of in your front end code the state of various back end services and kind of proactively do something about that. So one of the challenges that the front end folks often have is that from their point of view, the stuff that's going on at the other side of the HTTP request or gRPC request or whatever it is often a black box to them. It's like, I issued this thing. If nothing comes back, like, what do you want me to do? And there isn't really a good answer for
Hmm.
front end folks right now, except graceful degradation or client side awareness of the state of the infrastructure in that black box. And that's one of the things we provide. We provide a way for the components to go, oh, actually, like, login is down. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to even render the login button, because all you'll do is you'll sit there and you'll go click, click,
Yep.
click, 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 making the problem click times worse. And it won't actually like do anything for you.
Yep.
So we provide tools to damp down kind of client user sponsored load on stuff, and also make the interface that people are using kind of responsive to the actual state of things. There's this concept in front end called responsive design, which, if you've ever used the same website on a tablet or a phone or a desktop, you'll know that websites often kind of shrink and grow their layout or appear or disappear controls according to what the state is. The size of the device that you're looking at. And we have infrastructure responsive
Yep.
design, which is the same thing, except for actual reachability, or shall we say, capacity of the backend systems that the buttons or the controls would be talking to.
In this paradigm, do you think how would you communicate to the actual end user that, hey, we are probably reaching, some limits of our existing capacity, and therefore we are probably, at least for temporarily, not going to let you do something, may not be that may not be mission critical on your software, but there are some features that we're going to keep on for you so that your business, it's you're at least able to sort of
Yeah.
transact at some level, right? How do you communicate to customers at this point? I mean, I've seen this happen a lot with, like I mentioned, a lot of e-commerce companies, especially when you do, if you in the early days, right, when Amazon did Prime Day, or any of the e-commerce companies has their sort of major sale event, invariably the moment the sale goes live, for the first, half an hour or an hour, it's like a 5x exploit,
Yes.
right? Or it's this
I
final win.
believe it's traditional to
uh,
communicate to the customers by displaying a white screen and a spinning logo. That's how you communicate things are going wrong. I think that, jokes aside, one of the interesting things, again, coming back to this split about how back end and front end folks understand the user's reliability experience and what's appropriate to communicate to them, and so on and so forth. One of the interesting things about the front end world is that in some cases they're actually pretty reluctant to do kind of special case hacks for communicating with the customer.
yep.
Like, you could put
Mhm.
up a giant red blinking screen. Oh no, things are wrong, you know. But in fact, this tends to create panic, shall we say. So you're much better off
Yep.
uh, doing things which signal in a kind of a well understood way that the action you're trying to perform is not in fact possible. So one thing you will be very familiar with is the idea of graying out controls, and people kind of intuitively understand that if you've grayed out a control, you can't do that thing. Now, one of my personal bugbears as well is the extent to which companies don't communicate to the user what's going on, and so putting up a gray control is better than leaving the control there and it's not going to work. But it is not as good as graying out the control and putting up a pop-up or whatever that says undergoing maintenance, this will be restored in 20 minutes, or some equivalent message. I do think there's a huge amount of art and some science that surrounds how we communicate with the user and how the users react to differences in the pages that they're looking at. And some of them might not even be kind of consciously noticeable to many folks. Like, if you've ever gone to an e-commerce site and there's some kind of area of the screen that's painted with, okay, here are things we are suggesting you would like to buy, that's usually drawn by some kind of recommender system. And uh,
Yep.
those recommender systems are not, shall we say, 100% reliable, just like everything else in the world. And so I'm going to say that in your career of scrolling web pages, you have probably scrolled past a recommender system block that actually was populated with random things, or the top 10 things that the website sells, rather than the things that would have specifically appealed to you, and you might not even have noticed. So there is a huge piece of art to how we communicate with users and how we help them feel that the website is trying to do something useful for them, which isn't decidable in advance on a kind of a principled basis. You have to do a certain amount of case by case stuff, which is why we do libraries, and we help you to do this, to achieve this via kind of SDK approaches, rather than going, oh, just use our thing and forget about the rest of it. That's not realistic.
I was always thinking whether, our customers and our end users, they very rarely are in the gray area. They're more of the all or nothing. They have more of the all or nothing kind of thinking, where, if I'm transacting on a bank, or if I'm transacting on an e-commerce site, or even if it's a SaaS product, right, all of it has to work at the same time, right? A portion of the application, even if it's down, even if it's not a mission critical part of the application, even if it's down, then maybe uh, some resentment, there may be some level of risk of churn that is involved when a customer sees that, hey, a portion of the application is actually down, right? Do you think there is a difference between what there's a difference between the expectations of reliability from the customer side versus the expectations of reliability that the business sets for its engineering and its SRE team. Have you seen that
Every
happen?
day. I mean, I think one of the difficulties kind of at the heart of SRE is I don't feel we really understand the user behavior and user reaction to reliability very well. What we have in the movement, and I'm kind of obviously partially responsible for this, so do take my protestations with
Mhm.
a pinch of salt. But what we have is we have kind of appealing to the absolute case, which is to say, in the words of Andrew Clay Schaefer, the software has no value if the software is down, which is
Yep.
true, or at least it's mostly true. I also remember another conversation which I spoke about in a previous keynote, where I spoke to a very well known kind of online household name, and they said basically, we don't do any kind of work on reliability because our service is so sticky. If we're down, people will just come back. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's
Yep.
cool. All right. What happens if you.
Might have
Yeah.
might be a monopoly, right? Was it a monopolistic business?
Right. So you have hit upon the fact that understanding of reliability and the role of reliability and its interaction with users is governed by a business context in some sense. And yes, there are some business contexts, and okay, I'm using the word business to mean kind of everything, even things you don't necessarily exchange money for, right? But there's some kind of business context where some people will come back to you. Essentially, they're very delay tolerant or very kind of reliability tolerant, and in the long term, or I should say the medium term, actually. And then for some business contexts, if you don't reply in under 200 milliseconds, they'll go elsewhere. And like we don't really understand the vast space between those things. And like actually, one of the interesting things is if you hang out with front end folks a bit, you get to understand that they actually have a huge body of work and evidence and lore sometimes around questions of, well, if we render the web page in this following way, and the last item to be painted governs the time at which the first time at which a person can interact with anything on that screen. Well, the longer that goes on, the more people are inclined to just abandon because the screen is filling in and they can't do anything, like it's painting with lots and lots of ads, shall we say. Uh, but if you reorganize it so that they're not waiting for the time of the last content to paint or whatever, but they can interact with it earlier, even though you take physically the same amount of time to receive the data and all the rest of it, actually the user has a much better experience. So front end folks understand
Yep.
this quite well, and I think back end folks don't. So, coming back to your actual question, which is, do user expectations of reliability and, shall we say, leadership expectations vary? Well, yes, of course. Like, first of all, the users are hopefully kind of for your business reasons, right? Or for reasons to do with the sustainability of your business, hopefully your user population is quite large, which means they will have some kind of normal curve of distribution of reaction with respect to how your website is doing. And the business
Yep.
can't doesn't have the time to go around modeling this in any like very detailed way. So they're like, okay, 3 nines and we're done. Like you collapse all of this complexity into one number in SLO. And for sure that has some value, right? Like SLOs and setting targets and so on and so forth has huge organizational value, but it's not really reacting to or understanding the full spectrum of how users respond to things. So,
Of all the places that you've served in, right? Which place had the toughest um, reliability requirement or the toughest SLOs?
um, I referenced earlier the Google traffic team, which had a 3-minute SLA for responding to pages, which was basically take your laptop into the restroom with you.
Yep.
And be careful about going for a shower and so on and so forth. So that is the toughest I have experienced. There are there were some other on-call regimes I was aware of where the SLA for initial response was not as demanding, but the longer you left things wrong, the worse it would get. And sometimes there's a linear relationship. So Google Ads, back when I was working on it many years ago, used to be $2,500 a second, which is just a kind of arbitrary division of quarterly revenue by number of seconds in a quarter and so on and so forth.
Yep. Yep.
But I also worked on some of the machine learning systems there. And the weird thing about machine learning, as you may or may not know, is that you can have very strange effects. So when the model got old and you were and the training run had broken and you couldn't ship a new model, what would often happen is that revenue would go up, weirdly, and then plummet downwards until you shipped a new model.
Okay.
And obviously, you'd be like, oh, can we not just replace the model at precisely the right time so we get hit all of the peaks of the thing? But it turns out that for sufficiently complex kind of user to application interaction situations, that behavior is a very subtle thing that can't really be predicted well in advance. I will choose my words carefully.
Got it. I mean, I've read a lot of your talks. I've seen a lot of your talks, read a lot of your blogs. Right. I think and I've seen that you've helped a lot of orgs set up engineering and SRE best practices. Maybe not in an official capacity, even as an advisor. What is the one thing that you see newer companies, right? Companies that were probably born the last maybe half a decade, but born in the cloud. What is the one thing that most startups are getting wrong about reliability?
I suppose that I see kind of two things. The first one is, and there's been actually a fair amount of this over the past while. Uh, they decide that reliability is a business distinguishing feature, i.e., that they can
Hmm.
stand on a stage or have an ad or whatever that says reliability is our number one concern and so on and so forth, which
Yep.
doesn't necessarily survive, shall we say, other economic conditions or reorgs or whatever. So there's some disconnect, in other words, between, as you were saying earlier, how users value, receive, process reliability and how leadership does. And that just causes churn and kind of chaos. And often you end up in situations like, for example, if you start off an SRE org and then you start off with a centralized model and you change to a distributed model, or you push responsibility for reliability entirely into the end teams and you kind of wash your hands and walk away, churn around what you're doing is actually unhelpful to the user. So if I had to pick one recommendation for the first mistake, it's basically pick a strategy and stick with it. And if you are performing a cultural refit, like not for a newer organization, but for maybe an older one, if you're trying to do a cultural refit, refurbishment, those kinds of things take time. Often, like the number that goes around, the kind of circles I hang around in is 2 years. 2 years from starting to a refit or organizational refurbishment that is actually delivering solid results, which is a long time. But for many orgs, 2 years is actually quite a short time. The other mistake I see new folks making is to do with respect to how the people are doing their jobs, and sometimes um, their responsibilities aren't well understood by leadership and workers have a different idea of what those responsibilities are. So, for example, on call is well understood. Most people who have worked in engineering understand on call exists and its responsibilities and so on and so forth. You yourselves would understand that very well.
Yep.
There is a tendency in the industry for busy leaders to read the three letters SRE and go, somebody who's on call but clever, or somebody who's on call and cost a lot, or anything like that.
Yep.
So they understand the benefit of the SRE role primarily through the lens of on call. And they're like, if you're not on call, what are you doing actually? And that is a significant underselling of the idea of taking a holistic lens towards reliability. And reliability is often a thing that actually can't be made to happen by being excellent in any one individual silo. It's often a question of integrating across a bunch of silos. And one of the interesting things about how we conventionally manage organizations, of course, is that holistic thinking is one of these weird things that tends to happen at very high levels or low levels. I'll come back to what I mean in a moment. And not that much in between. So holistic thinking isn't often rewarded very well. So, what do I mean in a bit more detail? I mean that around the boardroom table or around the executive table or whatever for any organization, when you have a finance function and a HR function and an engineering function, or maybe one click down from that when engineering and product are kind of sitting around and talking, you have the opportunity formally to get these people who do front end and these people who do back end actually talking about their stuff, which is it doesn't happen all that often, unfortunately. And uh, there is an opportunity for that kind of work of talking between different divisions, communicating priorities, moving priorities, collaborating in order to get something done. That work is understood and rewarded there. But deep in the silo, the leaders don't necessarily understand this. They're like, you are in this silo to do your job. Like, do your job. What are you doing communicating with this other team kind of 3 steps away from you? And one of the weird things
Mm.
about the SRE role is that it's relentlessly horizontal. It's like, how can you ensure reliability or good operation of your service without understanding that all of these different systems serve different business needs and those people need to be spoken to?
Yep.
And I find this fascinating because I think there's a huge disconnect between how we manage organizations and what kind of conventional wisdom is and what people are actually doing on a day-to-day basis. And in, for example, the learning from incidents community and safety 2 community and so on, this is understood as work is done versus work is imagined, right? Which is to say that the day-to-day experience often involves considerably more ambiguity than how the abstract work is understood up there.
Hmm. Got it. I mean, I was actually there's something in your blog that sort of made sense. When I was reading it, right, and you're talking about the SRE book and how it's served the community for over 8 years now, right? A little below
2016, yeah.
8 years, and 2016, right? Uh, you mentioned that it's time to reevaluate what it says and recommends in the light of experience of all these other models and environments that we are familiar with now, right? That's sort of already part of the larger discourse. I mean, through SRECon and a few other conferences and many other communities that are just putting it out there now. I wanted to ask, what is the next version of the SRE book going to say, or what is it going to focus on? What are we moving on to
Well,
exactly?
yes, I should be very clear to say that I do not speak for my previous employer, and should my previous employer or employers decide that they wish to issue a book which is called SRE Next or whatever, that's totally fine, and they should do what they do, and I have no control of that. But if I was doing something new these days, I'd probably change quite a bit. I would bring in a lot more of what is called the LFI slash safety 2 stuff. I think there's a lot of organizational, uh, I don't want to say theory, but there's a lot of wisdom about how things work in organizations, which was absent the original book, precisely because, like, Google was at that stage a very homogenous kind of place. And so all of those organizational features kind of sank below the awareness of the people writing the book. But actually, it turns out that those organizational features or cultural features of how people worked together and collaborated were huge contributors to helping the SRE model work kind of fundamentally, which is actually you can see this very clearly in the run deck talk about by Damon Edwards in, I think, SRECon 2018, one of them anyway, which talks about doing SRE in the enterprise. And in particular, in the enterprise, you often tend to have some essentially deliberately slow mechanism or system or whatever in between things. The ticket queue is kind of
Okay.
the standard example. And
Mhm.
so SREs want to go around a ticket queue because, well, I am hand waving a lot of detail here, right? But SREs typically want to go and affect change as soon as possible for like obvious reasons. But a ticket queue often gets in the way. But a ticket queue serves certain kind of cultural assumptions about what work is valid and how the work is tracked and so on and so forth. And all of those cultural organizational questions uh, end up influencing how SRE is implemented. Anyway, I would bring a lot more of that. In terms of state of the art, how we're doing out there kind of technically and where our concepts are, I think I would put a lot more about SLOs, but I would put a lot more acknowledging the weaknesses of the model. And I would be, well, I wouldn't overemphasize the weakness, but I would put in, actually, it doesn't quite work for these kind of use cases, but it works better for these things. And also you can extend it and so on and so forth. So I would develop that a lot more. Another thing which has become clear to me in my time in the real world TM is that automation is a hugely scary concept to many organizations out there, many engineering cultures.
Mhm.
And so I would do a lot. In the original book, we talk about automation on a kind of a gradation of how you automate things. And I would fill in more of the beginning to give more people more steps to work with. And I also think one of the things where actually we have progressed a little bit more than I expected has been, in some ways, has been observability. And so we spend a bit of time talking about observability in the book, but possibly in the original book, but possibly we would do more now. Um, yep, that's off the top of my head.
You also mentioned you also mentioned something about incident management, and to quote you, there remain fundamental problems with how we conduct incidents, understand them, and model them. How do you see it evolving? How do you see incident management evolving?
Yeah, great question. I think part of the reason I said that is because there's this. coming back to the question of disconnects, there is this huge disconnect between how leadership models and understands incidents as being essentially short-lived deviations from some nominally perfect or correct path versus how workers kind of view incidents or view software in general. One of the things which is not clear, I think, to leadership is that actually sufficiently large software will actually, any software at all, which is kind of mind blowing, but certainly sufficiently complex software, cannot be proved to be stable. And this flows from kind of well understood theoretical, not just observations, but kind of theoretical underpinnings of computer science. So there's a thing called Rice's theorem, which is related to the halting problem. And the halting problem is a well-known thing in computer science, meaning you can't ever prove that a program will halt given a particular input. So it turns out you can't prove a program is stable. But you might imagine that this is some kind of abstract ivory tower thing over here and doesn't really have that much to do with day-to-day concerns. Well, kind of, but the thing which is true about the lived experience of many engineers who are on call and who are handling incidents and so on is that software is actually kind of fundamentally unstable. I won't go so far as to say non-deterministic, although sometimes I feel that's true. And definitely it's more true in as much as this proposition enjoys any stable truth value, but it's certainly more true in the world of ML and AI. Anyway, these systems that we are managing are very complex and tend to go wrong more or less indefinitely into the future. If you've studied linguistics, my favorite analogy is that a sufficiently complex distributed system is like a generative grammar for errors, for problems in the system. It just kind of spits out random things in which random ways in which it can go wrong indefinitely over time. So if that is the truth, if software is kind of fundamentally unstable and you're going to get incidents no matter what, this is a big difference from how leadership often understand incidents, which is somebody changed something, right? And your job is to unchange the thing, and then the system
And
will
change
be
it.
perfectly fine
Don't roll it
again. And
back.
I'm like, I don't think that's actually how it is. Like the other I probably shouldn't say this in great detail, but anyway, various companies I have been involved with have thought a lot about the Dior problem, like what would happen if an earthquake took out the valley or there was a volcano in the Cascades, or so this is Washington and California, where major major
Yep, yep.
headquarters are located, and like what would happen? And engineers would sit around saying, not how many years would GCP or Azure or whatever last if headquarters went down, but how many minutes? And this is not well understood by leadership. Not to say that DR plans aren't in place, right? There are all kinds of DR plans, but I think the extent to which the humans keep things going is not well understood. Um, anyway, long story short, I think if software is fundamentally unstable, one of the difficulties about incident management is coming back to this quadrant of known knowns and unknown unknowns in engineering. Uh, over time, eventually, you are going to have. I mean, obviously, you'll have an infinite number in every category, but you will come across unknown unknowns, essentially indefinitely into the future, and the unknown unknowns are the things where service cannot be restored by some simple kind of definitive procedure. Like in a lot of incident restoration or in a lot of incident management, the idea is, okay, let's find the button that we have to press which will restore things to the old way.
Yep.
but actually sometimes genuinely there is something new or weird about the environment, or even weirder about the users and how the users are behaving, which actually you can't necessarily control. And this can happen in the ML world a lot. And there isn't a single thing that you did before that you could just do again to restore service. And so I think incident management is for incident management to develop as, I don't think it's a profession necessarily, but to develop as kind of a school of thought or an approach, or however you would put that, it needs to be able to communicate this, that actually the nature of reality is not the first thing, but actually it's unknown unknowns, which are the real problem, and addressing that needs to be at the heart of how leadership understands incidents.
Do you think it's better to communicate the complexity of all these complex production environments directly to the user than to the leadership? Because at the end of the day, it's leadership is answering to the customers, it's answering to the market, right? Have you? I mean, how do you guys? How have you, in your opinion, communicated all of this complexities, all of this possible unknown unknowns to both the leadership and even the customers in some cases? That hey, this thing could happen
Yeah.
and it's all right.
So I appreciate that I've just spent the last 10 minutes telling you how complicated and difficult and philosophically intractable the world is. But actually, there are kind of a bunch of relatively simple things you can do to make the situation better. First thing you can do is on call work is generally speaking not valued. So the sound bite that I've used elsewhere is, in 11 years at Google, I never saw anyone, not once, be promoted for on-call work, good on-call work. Which,
Wow.
I mean, there was a reason for that, which is it is attached to the privileging of kind of software related approaches to things and so on and so forth. It was a very natural kind of outflow of a bunch of things that Google believed, kind of institutionally, shall we say. Um, in Microsoft, by the way, it wasn't that way, and there were people whose job it was to only do incidents, and there were people who were promoted as a function of doing that better. But uh, on-call work needs to be supported. It needs to be rewarded. It needs to be understood as a difficult thing that can be well done or badly
Yep.
done, and it actually would be better if the organization were to do it well. But this often involves spending money on it, and maybe it's vendor tooling money, or maybe it's on-call compensation, or maybe it's, hey, you were up until 5 o'clock solving this thing, don't come in until like 3 p.m. or whatever. All of this, all of these kinds of supports for that kind of work, if they are not present, lead to kind of burnout, cognitive dysfunction, yada yada yada, a bunch of things we know quite well. So that's one thing you do, kind of support the work. The second thing is you don't necessarily need to stand back and finger wag at either the customers or the leaderships and saying you just don't understand my pain or whatever. But there's a bunch of engineering work you can do to make the situation better. We spoke previously about graceful degradation, for example. There's a number of situations where something weird has gone real wrong, real fast, uh, that I've been involved in, and the graceful degradation mechanisms have kicked in to give the user some kind of access to some kind of data which is partially useful to them, rather than big white screen and a spinny logo. And
Yep.
engineering, in order to consider the failure cases and still provide some kind of uh, support to the user, is, in my opinion, a huge piece, which is again underinvested in typically, because coming back to this disconnect, if you have a 1-0, a Boolean model of systems, you're like, okay, system is perfectly functional, system is totally down. Actually, any sufficiently large system is partially broken all of the time. And so acknowledging that reality and leaning into it, in fact, and doing more kind of graceful degradation, etc., can be useful.
Got it. You think the whole graceful degradation paradigm is something that uh, in the future, I think, as companies are trying to squeeze as much profits as possible these days, right? And at least in this market, do you think the graceful degradation paradigm is something that the end user would be okay with? In fact, welcome, right? Hey, it's all right if you guys are facing some difficulties. It's all right if you guys are, you know, uh, either either already degraded or partially degraded. But thanks so much for at least letting us perform a few of these transactions or perform a few of these actions. You think they'll be grateful for
Yeah,
this?
so I think the way I'd put it, so I hear two things in that question. I hear graceful degradation is expensive, and so it might be hard to argue
Exactly.
for its creation. And I hear also users can respond well to non-perfect functioning all of the time, particularly if you communicate with them. So I agree with
Yep.
both of those things. But in the first case, I would say graceful degradation doesn't necessarily need to be that much more expensive. Sometimes it can involve simply reusing a thing you're already doing, but you haven't thought that you could reuse it in this particular way. For example, caching. So most systems have some or even multiple levels of caching. And if they can't get the new request, there's the ability to ship out the old one. Well, what happens when that gets too old or whatever? Well, you can put some kind of gray border around the result and say this result might be old or whatever.
Yep.
Um, my experience as a user, which I very carefully am not saying is the whole world's response as a user, but my response as a user is that whenever anyone takes the time or care to put up a thing and say, by the way, like this is actually slightly bad or whatever, I'm like, oh, thank you for telling me. Like, I really appreciate this. And it makes it
Yep.
work for me.
Exactly. Awesome. There's something that, and this is the final question that we end all of our podcasts with, which is, without breaking your NDA, are there any of your favorite war room stories? Maybe something that really went, that was in the unknown category, but actually went really well.
Gosh. Um, yes, there's one. I think. Let me see. Can I? How detailed can I be? There was one where uh, a bad change which had escaped, shall we say, the standard checks. It escaped the standard checks because it was a permissions problem. So let's say this isn't quite it, but let's say that the permissions on an important binary got changed to or, like only read and not execute. So let's say that this got pushed out and started turning, I don't know, sbin init, which is the binary you run when you're starting up, whatever. Let's say it made that
Yep.
unexecutable. So what would happen, of course, is that you wouldn't notice anything for a couple of days, and then gradually bits of your fleet start going dark because the systems reboot, and maybe there's an entire data center power
Yep.
outage and all of those systems lose power, go down. Then you turn the power back on and none of them come back up. Let us say, hypothetically, that situation happened. Then you might be running around attempting to figure out why this wasn't happening. But it's one of the things that often makes certain kinds of incidents very, very difficult to understand and appreciate what's going on. There's actually an analogous incident with Datadog. Uh, One of the reasons they didn't catch a bad push was that the bad push was at the operating system level, in their case to do with networking, if I recall
Yep.
correctly. And that level was essentially dark to their monitoring systems because they really only monitored the application layer and up, shall we say. So I think one of the things that tends to
Yep.
create very complex incidents is mixed infrastructure and application level interactions.
Awesome. Thanks, Niall. I mean, this was a lovely talk. Learned a lot. I mean, we'll keep following you guys, you and the Stanza team on social media. Of course, we'll keep following you on your blogs as well. I mean, looking forward to meeting you sometime, maybe in the next SRECon or KubeCon if you're
Pretty good.
if you're in the States anytime. But thank you so much for making time.
Andrew,
Pleasure
thank
talking to
you.
you.